just to kind of get a little bit of background about who the LGBTQ youth community is. One of the things overall in Gallup polling is that we have seen over the last 10 years a steady rise of people that will identify themselves openly as being part of the LGBTQ community, or at least something, sometimes it's been in question, not heterosexual. And you can see this kind of rise from being under 5% in 2012 to 7.2 in 2022. Last year's at 7.1, so we're kind of holding steady right now. And you can see that market increase. But what is really interesting here is that Gen Z, this youngest generation that has been polling, I know there's Gen Alpha coming up on their heels very quickly, is nearly 20%. And that 20% actually is also held very steady for the last 2 years. So, but despite the fact that you see like, oh, it's 7% of the population, when we look at the people that are in the midst of youth ministry right now, we're looking at 1 in 5 of them to be some part of the LGBTQ community. They don't all necessarily use the same terms, and they are using more and more diverse terms to describe themselves and to talk about themselves. But they also are going to come to understand themselves to be part of that community. The other thing that we also share is that people are much more aware of LGBTQ people, have relationships with them, know them. So the number of allies is even stronger because these are their friends, right? These are their classmates. These are their family members. And so youth ministry for LGBTQ youth is not just for the LGBTQ youth, but also with the family and friends that go with them. So we're not talking about a small part of the population anymore. We are talking about a significant portion of the population. And that is already changing the makeup of who our churches are, how they relate to our church, our workforces, our schools, the way we run our society. And we're also seeing that LGBTQ youth have come with particular needs. This has always been true for a long time, right? LGBTQ youth can face bullying, can face harassment, can face erasure, can face opposition, some of that coming from churches, and that has a very personal impact on them, right? We are talking about a part of their identity. We're talking about a part of what makes them who they are. Their sexual orientation, their gender identity is not their entire identity, but they are words that they would use to describe themselves. So, I always like to say when we talk about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, any of these terms, they are adjectives that describe people. And yet, we also can see this hang up happening for a while too. The Trevor Project is a really good resource that I hope you are familiar with. If not, you should look them up. One, they provide mental health. They provide, their main project is suicide prevention. They have a hotline or a text line that youth that are really feeling alienated or in trouble can call or text and talk to someone who talk them down, help them to find resources, help them feel better about themselves. But Trevor also now publishes research as well. And I think it's helpful to sort of know how LGBTQ youth are feeling, both in society and in the church. Nearly half of them, 45%, have seriously considered attempting suicide in the last year. And that number is much higher if you kind of break this apart. Transgender youth, and we'll talk about why that is in a few slides here, are facing much higher suicidal ideation, where nearly 1 in 5 have attempted suicide, and LGBTQ youth of color have higher rates than their white peers. So this is not evenly distributed among the LGBTQ community. There's disproportionate impacts that fall on transgender youth and youth of color, right? But if they feel support from their family, it cuts the suicide ideation and the suicide attempts by nearly half, right? And so you can see that having supportive adults in their lives can be particularly helpful. And then you see that fewer than 1 in 5 of transgender or non-binary youth find their home to be gender affirming, right? So having those supportive adults makes a huge difference. It is best if it's your family, if those closest relationships that you have, but even having other supportive adults in your life can also make a huge, huge difference. And so you see here, LGBTQ youth who found their school to be affirming will lower the rates of attempting suicide. And youth want mental health and mental support. And a lot of them are having difficulty accessing that, perhaps because of their local community. It's a resource that's not available. Perhaps they don't feel like they can be out enough to get those kind of supports. And this, kind of reiterating here more and more, we need supportive adults just in order to lower rates of self-harm, of suicide. And that's coming from Trevor. You can kind of see how that has ebbed and flowed over the years. And as youth ministry practitioners, I want us to be those people that can help to reduce the rates of self-harm, of suicide ideation. The nice thing, the great thing that for me is that Trevor also put out a report just at the end of last year that talked about religion and spirituality among LGBTQ youth. And so we can see that 1 in 5 LGBTQ youth report that their religion or their spirituality is important or very important to them. That's the big headline that sort of got taken away from this report. And I want to make a note about that. When we started the naming project, one of the things that often shows up is this narrative that to be part of the LGBTQ community means inherent conflict with your religion or inherent conflict with your spirituality. And that doesn't have to be true. Right? There are people who find supportive church homes, worshiping community homes, supportive communities, and get to live out their call. I get to be one of them, right? I'm a deacon, and I'm openly gay, and I do this particular work. And so we don't have to have this conflict. And we see that there's still pretty high levels of spirituality among LGBTQ youth. You can see here sort of the breakdown in terms of religion and spirituality for LGBTQ youth by race, and seeing indigenous spirituality is incredibly important and also tied in with identity. Middle Eastern, North African, very high levels of religiosity or spirituality among youth. And these various levels, right, that you kind of see as a breakdown for race, which I think is also particularly important, because sometimes people also will pull in this false notion of a conflict between someone's race and they're being part of the LGBTQ community. And LGBTQ people are part of every walk of life, urban, rural, every race, every gender, every ability, every class, right? And so we don't just say that it doesn't exist within this community. It is part of every single community. And you can see, like, for spiritual practices, things like prayer or meditation, how often someone does it, right? What kind of spiritual practices they do. And I find this sort of interesting. If we're seeing ourselves as youth ministry practitioners, we can also help young people to develop those spiritual practices that are going to give them a sense of purpose, a sense of community, a sense of connection and being with God, with a higher power, with how they can feel themselves connected to the rest of the world. Very few are doing it on a daily basis. I think this is a growth area that we could help to build and develop, and that we can do some of that teaching and training and guiding with which to do that. And then, of course, because it's Trevor, what are those mental health what are the mental health outcomes for this as well, right? And if spirituality is important to them, then how high are their levels of anxiety and depression, or suicide ideation or attempts, right? And you can see that spirituality can make a difference. It's not a gigantic difference, but one I think that we can also, by making affirming churches, by making affirming places of worship and communities, we can help to lower those as well. And it doesn't just do it for the youth that are in our congregations or in our direct care. Also, how we communicate that out to the wider world is going to have those outcomes for people, even if they don't necessarily come into our church. And that is one thing I'm going to talk about a little bit later, about how we can look at this. But I think this always helps kind of ground of, like, how many LGBTQ youth are there? How often how much are they in our churches? What is their beliefs and spiritual practices? And seeing that this can be an area where we can both help to develop and change and grow, and meet the needs of people that are in our communities, even if they're not necessarily in our worshiping communities.